Welcome, everybody, to Catalyzing Conversations, part of the Catalyzing the Future event series, where we talk to all sorts of great thinkers and speakers about how we can plan for better, more sustainable sorts of futures, utilizing things like future foresight, agility, anti-fragility, resilience, and other modes of thinking that are human-powered and human-centric. I am with my friend here today, Mr. Sai here, the founder of the event. Welcome, Sai. Good to see you again. Oh, I think we've lost your sound, Sai. I'm not sure.
Oh, thank you so much, Todd. Always a pleasure, my good friend. Thank you.
Really happy to be continuing this series. The Catalyzing the Future event was held on September the 30th. It was part of a series of events that we've done, starting with a couple of others. Most notably, I got involved with Transcending the Crisis, and now we're to Catalyzing the Future. I think that future orientation is really kind of where we've had our eye on things through these events. And what we're looking forward to next is something called the micro workshops on December the 9th. Did you want to maybe talk a little bit about that for a minute?
Most definitely. There's been a lot of good conversations around multiple events, so broad and deep and different perspectives from all over the world. And now we're really focused on getting actionable techniques and practices in people's hands. And that is going to be the focus in December. So look for sort of a deeper announcement around who's going to be providing micro workshops and all the possibilities that come of that over the next week in particular.
Yeah, all of that's going to be happening very soon. So stay tuned for more announcements about that, as you said. Today, however, to continue our series of catalyzing catalytic conversations. I know you've been using a different phrase that I have, Syed. I apologize for that.
No, all good. All good.
We have with us Dr. Laurence Barrett, the founding director of Heresy Consulting Limited. I love the name of that company. Analytical psychologist, a coach of coaches. Really eager to be digging into that. And my understanding is we're going to maybe be digging into a little bit about some recent conversations he's had on LinkedIn around maybe the pitfalls of putting vulnerability on a leadership pedestal, and what's involved with maybe how we can think a little more clearly about that, and maybe also get some ideas from Laurence about how he coaches leaders and their coaches looking into 2021. So let's go ahead and welcome him into the channel here. Hi, Laurence. Nice to meet you.
Hi, gentlemen. Nice to be here.
It's great. It's great to have you.
Laurence, can you maybe tell us a little bit about your background? Introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure. Well, I'm not a doctor. I have to stress that up front.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
not that qualified. I spend most of my working life in international corporate organizations, working with leadership and organization development. I left that world. Well, I said I left that world. I left that world as an internal person back in 2011. And since then, I've been focusing on working with Heresy, where I was a founder director, looking at rethinking how we may approach organizational life and leadership. I guess my motivation was a simple one. I spent 20 years, I guess, in corporate life, and it felt a little like Groundhog Day. You'd see people running the same interventions. They'd give them different names, but they're basically the same interventions in broadly the same way, and they would fail for the same reasons. And you do this 3 or 4 times, and eventually it just got to be here we go again. Let's just watch this fail. And it's quite easy to get very cynical and fairly negative about that. What I wanted to be able to do, and I guess the driver behind Heresy, wouldn't it be interesting if we returned to really the psychology that makes us human, not a kind of slightly idealistic occupational psychology, but a really grounded psychology. And what is it about human beings? What do we do? How do we think? How do we work? Wouldn't it be cool if we built organizations, organizational theory, leadership around that fundamental grounding? And maybe that would work. It was a bit of a punt, I guess. And what we found, I think, over the last 8 years, 9 years, is the closer we get to that real, very raw clinical psychology, the more effective the work happens to be. Which is perhaps not surprising, but it is quite interesting to watch, actually. So most of my work now, I've been doing a lot of work with leadership and organization development. I'm increasingly focusing much more on coaching supervision, and working more with coaches and with the developers of leaders rather than with the leaders themselves, but still keeping my hand in, as you might expect.
Excellent. Laurence, you mentioned some very, very crucial words that I really want to hone in on. One is grounded. The world today perhaps is a little bit over idealistic. Yeah. I'm posing it as a question, just kind of a question. And then the other word that you keenly mentioned is getting back to the raw in order to have that effective. I'd love for you to kind of tell us, share with us kind of what you're seeing in the world. Are we too idealistic? Are we not grounded enough? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I don't think we're grounded enough. Idealistic, yes. I think we're very narcissistic as well. I think we have a tendency to favor quick, light, ill-considered solutions. And I think, to be honest, particularly in the space of development where, let's face it, we're dealing with people's lives, we need to take our work a little bit more seriously. And for me, this comes in sort of two ways. There's a great, I don't know if it's an apocryphal story, but it always amuses me, and I like it a lot. When Freud was dying of cancer, one of his students came to him and apparently said, asked a question about some aspects of psychoanalysis, and then they immediately stopped themselves and said, I'm terribly sorry to acknowledge you with this. I know you've got serious things to worry about. Freud apparently replied, no, cancer is fatal, but it's not serious. And I think that is for me an important thing to think about, because it gets things into context. The work that we do in development is serious work. We shape people's lives. We shape the lives of their families, of their organizations. We shape their relationships. All of this is indirect, but it's very real. It's very tangible. And to an extent, we shape the societies that we're part of. So in a way, one of the things that I've talked about quite a lot in other forums is, people blame the problem leaders that we have in the world, but let's face it, we're not blessed with an enormous sort of plethora of great leadership generally when you look across the world. But I don't blame them. I don't blame the leaders at all, actually. My concern is really more for the people that put them there, the institutions that created them, the business schools that have trained them, the directors, HR directors, the boards that have coached them, supported them, driven them to those positions of power. Because I don't think we take seriously enough the quality of work that we do and the quality of leadership and organizational structures that we produce. And so when I'm talking grounded, what I'm really trying to get at it, let's go back and look at some really raw theory and go, okay, is that actually what the theory says? Because if it isn't, why are we doing it? Are we doing it out of some sort of collective delusion or best practice, whatever that happens to be, or something that sounds easy and cool, and wouldn't it be nice if this was true, even though it's not, but let's not talk about that. So I think there's a need to recognize that the work of psychology, the work of coaches, is based upon hundreds of years of empirical research. So let's reconnect with that. What does it tell us? And therefore, what do we do?
Yeah. Laurence, if we look at the landscape, and you mentioned again 2 key words, are coaches and are people really using blame to avoid responsibility, to avoid getting back to that raw, to the basics? Are we, in a sense, really embracing our own delusions or believing our own stories?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Narcissistic defense. Yeah. I mean, I think there's some great stuff going on there. And there's so many ways I could think about your question. And let's pick up the blame thing first. Everyone who's got kids will recognize those moments of, I hate you, you've ruined my life, because you won't let me go to this party, or you won't let me wear that dress or that shirt. And It's fine. I mean, as a kid, that's fine. That's what kids do. We look at our parents and we blame them for the things that have gone wrong in our life. And when we get a bit old to blame our parents, we blame other institutions and our schools and all of the other shit that goes on around us. And I think that's fine. I think it's fine as a kid. I think as an adult, we need to recognize that our world is in part created by us. We make it. We make choices about how we talk to people. We make choices about who we put into our teams. We make choices about who we vote for, what products we buy. And every choice we make has a consequence. I'm not being idealistic here. We sometimes have to buy things or choose people in our teams or vote for people that we might not be perfect and might not be absolutely ideal. But my point is, we're aware of those choices. Or are we instead looking at the world around us and I'm nothing to do with this, there's something bigger than me. So I think firstly it's around choice. And I think one of the most significant pieces of work a coach can do is develop effectively self-agency within their client. How do we help our clients recognize their power and authority within the world to make choices about how they choose to live? Not what they choose to happen, because, let's face it, the world can be ugly. Sometimes we have a history of humanity of not doing very nice things to each other, and life can be hard. I mean, all life is suffering, as a Buddhist may say. But we do have a choice to how we show up to that. And so, in a way, one of the sort of core pieces of work as a coach, I think, is to help people build the ego strength needed, the agency needed to recognize their responsibility for the world around them. And I think, therefore, we have to do that as well.
You have some very, very intriguing thoughts as when you and I first talked, most definitely, my good friend. So I know there's been a lot of conversation around vulnerability. I mean, how do you see that kind of playing into, I'm going to say the global psyche of where we are, especially today, Laurence?
And if I could tag on to that, I think one of the interesting things that you had mentioned earlier was the word narcissism, and I saw you had connected that in maybe some interesting potential ways with vulnerability, how that it could be a sort of a narcissistic trait that gets collected.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of possible ways into that. I think narcissism and vulnerability are very linked. Let's have a think about vulnerability. There's a trend at the moment to talk about vulnerability, which I have a degree of skepticism about. And we've had some interesting conversations on this on LinkedIn. I would start by saying I think vulnerability is a necessary requirement to grow and develop. There's always going to be that. Michael Fordham, who's was a very great developmental psychologist and analytical psychologist, had a wonderful expression where he talked about what he termed deintegration and reintegration. So if we're going to learn a little, we have to deintegrate. It's fall to pieces. And then we have to somehow bring those bits back together and kind of make them part of ourselves. So we have to be able to experience those fragmentary moments of shit, what am I going to do now? And then learn, and you move forward and you develop and you grow. And so vulnerability is good. It's important. If we're invulnerable, we can't grow. We're stuck in a circle. But the problem is, if vulnerability becomes a trait, an exciting desired state where everybody needs to be more vulnerable, we are losing sight of the reality of vulnerability, which is vulnerable people are vulnerable. If you are vulnerable, you're vulnerable to attack. We know, for example, as well, that the idea of projections creates a phenomenon you might term a sadistic impulse, which is if you are vulnerable and I am afraid of my own vulnerability, one of the best defenses I can deploy is to persecute you, because that will remind me of how invulnerable I am by exaggerating, if you like, your vulnerability. So vulnerability creates a sadistic impulse. It creates persecution. So if we encourage leaders to be vulnerable for its own sake, some people will attack them. And I wonder about the ethics of that. I think as well, vulnerability may then become a piece of persona. I'm going to pretend to be vulnerable. I'm going to be vulnerable in ways that aren't really vulnerable, but they'll encourage you to be vulnerable. Now, is that healthy? Is that helpful? I think it's pretty dangerous, again, because some people may take you seriously. I think as well, we devalue the concept of vulnerability, because many people, of course, will look at a leader who does that and think, yeah, he's not really being vulnerable, he's just having a laugh, and therefore it doesn't really mean anything. On the latter, by the way, there was a very interesting example that I worked with some years ago. I remember, and I have to be a bit cautious how I describe this, because it was quite a personal, quite a charged situation for the individual concerned. They'd been on a workshop where they'd been encouraged to be vulnerable. And they had confessed to the group that they were working with that they'd been subject to some considerable amount of sexual abuse. And everyone had patted them on the head and gone, yeah, that's great, you're vulnerable, now let's move on. And I picked this guy up later on, several months later. And frankly, he wasn't in a good state at all. It had raised a lot of issues for him that he'd no way of dealing with, no way of making sense of. He didn't want to go to a therapist because that would make him mad, which he didn't want to be. He was uncomfortable talking about it at work now. And it kind of loomed there. Everyone knew, everyone thought it was like really thrilling that this guy had been vulnerable. But for him, it was a pretty crushing state. And I had spent quite a lot of time working with him to help him make sense of what was happening enough to then progress and seek professional help. It was pretty harsh to see that. And I remember at the time thinking this idea was being thrown around really lightly, and people were pretending, and it was an awful lot of fun for the coach concerned that they were running these deeply powerful vulnerability workshops without really thinking about the fallout that was happening. So I think there are some real risks around this, and my sense is, from a coaching perspective, yeah, if vulnerability is still a good thing, if it's a necessary thing to develop, the question then becomes much more around how do we create spaces where vulnerability becomes an act, becomes part of what we do, but it's within a safe space, it's within a psychologically contained space where people can be worked through the process, so they're able to build enough ego strength, enough agency to allow them to then not be vulnerable in a way, but accept the ideas of, let's say, self-doubt. Because without that, I think you're asking for trouble. And the connection with narcissism is an interesting one. There's a great, he does a lot of work on LinkedIn, and he's written a brilliant book called Malignant Self-Love, a guy called Sam Bakin, whose work on narcissism is really fantastic, and I'd recommend that anybody has a look at that. But I remember reading from him once, he described a narcissist as somebody within whom there is a small child locked away who can never be allowed to see the light of day. And we have to, in a way, see narcissism not as an overconfidence, but as a compensation for a complete absence of confidence, So, in a way, narcissists are deploying the ultimate defense to the absolute experience of vulnerability. And we all do that to a degree. But it's a great image because it reminds us, I think, of the reality, the clinical reality of vulnerability, which is it can be an experience of fear up to and including an absolute existential threat. So as coaches, are we able to deal with that? Have we worked through ourselves, our own vulnerability? Do we understand some of the theory about it? Do we know the forces we're unleashing? And so if we take a real light view on it, it's like, yeah, let's all be vulnerable. It's not grounded, actually. It's based on this kind of idealism that will all somehow magically develop if everybody's vulnerable. Whereas the actual reality of humankind is, yeah, it's important, but it's serious, and actually up to and including, the psychological breakdown of an individual. So how do we deal with that? Are we really standing with our feet on the earth?
So there's another word that I often sort of see paired with vulnerability, as advice for leaders. It's that you need to be authentic. So is authenticity, is that just sort of a dodge word or a mealy word for like asking people to be vulnerable, or do you see that as somewhere on a scale? What's your reaction to that?
Well, again, I think they're three different words: vulnerability, authenticity, and authentic. They're all different words. and they actually do mean different things. They have an underlying connection. Talked about vulnerability. Let's talk about authentic. Now let's talk about authenticity. That's another good one. Authenticity is a state, and yeah, it can be vulnerable. That's true. But if you've worked that through and you've experienced vulnerability and you've moved in a way through to the other side, you've integrated those aspects that make you afraid, that self-doubt, and you're comfortable with that, in a way you're not vulnerable, but you are still acting with authenticity. You're still showing up without a mask. But actually you've worked through the space to the point where you're confident enough to go, yeah, I doubt myself sometimes. You're not spewing your emotions out in front of everybody. Authentic, though, upsets me a little bit more. I think authentic implies that there is a single fixed goal. You find it and you're done. And to be honest, that's just bullshit. We change and move as we move through life. You're not the same person as you were 5 years ago, and you won't be the same person in 5 years' time. We have this kind of illusion that there's some little truth within us. I don't think that's true at all. I think we have themes. We have threads that move through our lives. But those threads change and evolve. So authenticity is a good word because actually you're in a moment. But authentic, I don't know. For me, it just implies this kind of end goal. And you see this sometimes in the subtext of how people are talking. I think as well, we all have different, Jung described them as complexes, subpersonalities, which are real. I show up differently when I'm with my family to when I'm with my clients. Is one authentic and one's not? Well, not really, because my clients demand different things of my personality, and I am a different person in some ways. In some ways I'm the same, and in some ways I'm actually a little different because my role is different. I'm asked to be a different person. And I think that's quite important to remember that, because in a way what I'd be saying to people is behaving with vulnerability is great if you're in a safe place. Behaving with authenticity, fantastic, as long as you recognize it's not a single achievable goal. Cut yourself some slack. Am I showing up in this moment in an authentic way? Am I showing up with authenticity? Yeah, it's great, but it's not the whole of me. There are many ways you can be, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. I think that idea even extends to our online personas, right? We construct ourselves differently, even depending on the platform we happen to be on, whether Facebook versus LinkedIn versus Twitter versus here on a video call. Even our backgrounds are an expression of ourselves in some ways.
Yeah, that was fun.
I like your expression, by the way. So.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's a really narrow line because, persona will always be important, and again, persona gets a bad rap. I think the question with the masks we wear are they? Do we confuse them ourselves with reality, or are they just a mask? I think the former becomes problematic. The latter is pretty useful. If you're a parent, you have to be able to put that mask on with your kids. Otherwise, you're not going to be a very good parent. They need to see you in a particular role, which might not be the role that you play with your college mates or whatever. So I think persona is important, but again, it's the seeing of it. What is happening here, the awareness of that. If we look at the self as an idea, the Jungian sort of concept of the self, which I, again, tend to like, is self is an infinite possibility. Now, on the basis of the fact that it's an infinite possibility, you can be everything. So authenticity then becomes how you show up in a particular point in time. Does it feel right at that point in time? Are you aware of it? So in the same way as I'm talking about theory and, psychological theory and coaching, I think it again comes back to the sense of, are we grounded here? Are we behaving in a way that where you can look at yourself and go, yeah, I'm doing that thing now. Okay, I get that. Okay, I'm going to do that thing. Or are you deluding yourself in some way that what you're doing is real, is absolute, is the only truth, is the only way? Do we believe that our truths are the truths that we all have? And, I hear this sometimes with coaches. Well, everybody wants this. Well, do they? Really? And it makes me bridle because sometimes, I have sat there with other coaches and gone, well, I don't want that. So let's talk about that then. How does that play out? Which feels very passive aggressive to do it, but occasionally, it is worth calling out that your truth is just your truth. It's your truth at a point in time. It's not your truth for all time, and it's not my truth. And I think we have to be able to recognize that and to be able to look within ourselves and go, okay, so what's really going on here, and what role do I play in my life and in the world around me? And if I'm clear about that, as clear as I can be, given the fact that everything's changing and the unconscious is a fairly big place, I think we're a step better, a step further forward. We're better off, if that makes sense.
It totally does. Sai, I see you've got a question on your lips there. So
definitely, and this is a number of questions. Laurence, what are the other topic that seems to be out there, and I know I've mentioned it in some of our conversations, is the whole dynamic around psychological safety, very much in the same vein as vulnerability and what have you.
Yeah. I mean, this has again become an interesting and slightly confusing term. I think some coaches and some people would confuse this with lack of challenge, and I don't feel that those are psychologically safe spaces at all. If we imagine how we grow and we learn, let's come back to this point about deintegration and reintegration. If learning is a falling apart, if there is a rawness, that experience is going to be slightly frightening. It's going to be slightly edgy. Anyone who's ever really learned anything will tell you that those moments where that deintegration occurs are actually pretty scary moments, and you suddenly, that's a bit difficult. And in those moments, you will have conflict because you'll suddenly realize that other people have different perspectives to you. Quite often, those moments will come from provocations or experiences which in themselves are quite frightening. You may be asked to take on a different perspective, to imagine a different existence, to confront, and even someone listening to this video, there will be people who listen to this and going, this is unacceptable what he's saying. Well, great, that's a deintegrative experience. This is something to be able to play with, to work with. You will then make choices that some of those things are useful to you and some of those things are not useful to you. But that whole experience is a challenging experience. It's a tension, if you like. It's an experience of conflict. And so if a space is going to be developmental, it must accept conflict. The difficulty, of course, is that conflict can't get out of control. You can't do what we might describe as disintegrate. You need to be able to hold something. You need to be able to contain them. And in that containing space, the role of the coach or the facilitator or the parent, their role is in essence to allow play to happen, allow people to talk, to communicate, to explore different imaginal ideas, to be vulnerable, but never to feel that they're under an existential threat, that they're going to fall to pieces, that there's always some kind of boundary, if you like. So for me, a psychologically safe space is a space within which conflict happens, but doesn't spill over, where people don't fall to pieces. The conflict stays in the space, stays where it is.
Very, very well said. I want to actually, what's interesting is you've used keywords of disintegration and reintegration, integration. And what I have found in my work is sometimes those words don't land with people. They don't land. So yeah. I've used a little bit more, I'll say, edgy words. I've used the word literally death. There's an element of death and rebirth. And that seems to hit, that seems to have a little bit more impact, quite honestly, Laurence.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think death is an interesting one. I mean, James Hillman, amazing psychologist. I'd recommend anybody reads everything Hillman's ever written. But Hillman saw death as a kind of archetypal symbol for the experience of letting go of something, which may become embodied as an actual death, but may also literally be the experience of I was this, I'm not that. That's a death, and is often experienced as a death. So people do use those terms. Yeah. I guess when I'm talking about the words of kind of psychology is, I think there's a difference between the words we use when we are thinking of our practice and the words we encourage our clients to use. So hence, with vulnerability, it's a really difficult one, because I think I would talk to clients about vulnerability in certain contexts, I suppose. I wouldn't use the terms de-integration, reintegration, although I might, depending on the client. Some clients might like that. I think for me, though, the important question for any coach is, are we using those words, again, coming back to that kind of insight, knowing that we're using the words because actually they're good words for this particular moment, this particular client, or are we confusing them with something else? So when we use the term ego, are we thinking about ego as a psychological construct, or are we thinking about it as a pop psychology construct? I think the latter is, best avoided. The former is really helpful, but then you probably wouldn't use that with clients. You just need to know it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the power of, and it's interesting, the terminology, exactly to your point, the power of being grounded in context. Yeah. People don't make that leap, and they make it more about the coach versus actually what the intent of the interaction with.
Absolutely.
So it's always intriguing. So I'm going to ask a very, very blunt, direct, very broad question, and I think you see this coming, and I think Todd sees this coming. In order to coach,
yep,
you have to have traversed, excuse my language, a hell of a journey.
Yeah, I agree. Fully agree.
And it's demonstrated literally through the impact and through the conversation. I mean, sitting here with you in this interaction, you've been through a hell of a journey to be able to do what you do, respectfully. A lot of people out there as coaches, they go to a certification or what have you, and get a label and get a brand, and I'm out there doing it now as a coach. What do what do you say to the world in that context, my friend?
I think it's a really interesting point. There's the old quote that you wouldn't trust someone to lead you out of the desert who'd never been there. And I think it's really important that coaches have lived. And I think it's really important that they've examined themselves. They need to have done the work to do the work. Mm-hmm. And that requires a good degree of humility. Narcissism, in a way, has no place in this work. It's always going to be there to a point, I mean, let's face it, we all like being appreciated and it's good. It's all great. But I think that there is a need for a good deal of self-examination and self-doubt. A good need for as much knowledge as you can get, and then recognizing you still don't know enough. You have to be able to, as a coach, question everything. Do I know enough? Is that real? Is what happening now just a projection, or is it a reality? Is it my reality? Is it your reality? Okay, let's go through that loop again. Let's just check we're still doing that. Is that still right? Because all we're ever doing is building hypotheses. We can never know. And that requires, when you really think about that requires quite a lot of humility, because at the end of the day, some of the magic, the magic of that intersubjective coaching relationship, some of it might be the coach, some of it might be the coachee, some of it, and most of it probably, is simply the relational magic that happens between them. Yeah. So I hear these things like, coaches ask powerful questions. I hear that a lot. I don't know what a powerful question is. Yeah. I don't know what it would be. I don't know if I ask them or not. Maybe I do sometimes. Probably most of my questions are a bit lame. The real challenge is, does it land with the person at the moment?
Yes.
And are they allowed to run with it? Is this something they're developing? And am I sitting there helping, watching, probing, pointing in a safe space? Mm-hmm. Or am I manipulating the relationship so that I feel good about myself?
Yeah. And I'm sure coaches are going to be listening to this recording, etc. One of the major takeaways that I would encourage, and definitely please chime in, Laurence, on this point, and likewise, Todd, I love how many times you reference other people's work and stand on the shoulder of giants. A lot of coaches out there think they're inventing everything. Yeah, and it's like, wait a minute, get the foundation in place before you even engage. Any thoughts there, Laurence? Because I see it all the time, respectfully. It's like they're making, I invented this. Wait a minute. I welcome your thoughts.
I completely agree. I think for me, that's what I mean by the humility. I mean, we're building on a body of knowledge, and we're working with it in the moment. Jung had a great quote, which I can't remember exactly, so I'm only going to paraphrase it, where he said that the closest we can ever come to understanding the unconscious is with the words "it is as if." ... Now, when you really think about the implications of that, I'm working with somebody. I have no idea really. I'm using lenses, I'm using experiences, I'm using ideas, most of which have not come from me, but have come from people with a lot more experience than I have. But I'm accumulating them, and I'm testing this stuff, and maybe one of them will stick. And when it sticks, you can see it. You can see it in your clients, and your client will work with it. So in a way, it's not really about you. You're simply a channel for ideas and possibilities and symbols, some of which land. And when they land, the client will work with it because it's their work, it's their psychology, it's their development that matters. And I think that's a really powerful thing to be able to hold on to, actually. In fact, in some ways, it's really relieving because, you show up and you do your stuff. And if it doesn't work, hey, it's not my problem anyway, really. The client is also taking responsibility for their own work. But we are in a partnership where we are. But I mean, I think there's a American psychologist called Nathan Schwartz-Selland, and again, I'm not paraphrasing correctly. He described therapy, which I think is the same true for coaching, as two people mutually constellating the unconscious. And I love that as a way of thinking because we're kind of working together, and stuff happens, and hopefully, if we do that in a reasonably grounded and thoughtful way, that stuff is useful, and that's the best you can achieve, really.
Yeah. So I've got another question. This one, Todd, please, interrupt me because I can keep going with Laurence here. But so I'm sure you're familiar with. For the life of me now, his name escaped me. Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
I love the blink of the eyes when I said the name. That was beautiful. And he definitely has a perspective to offer the world.
He does.
I welcome your thoughts.
I won't be drawn on that one. I won't be drawn on that one. I'm not a massive fan of Jordan Peterson, but
he does offer a perspective, if nothing else.
He offers a perspective, yeah.
And that's the reason I mentioned it that way.
I guess for those who maybe don't know who Jordan Peterson is, could you maybe give a quick glossy?
I would say Google him. I can't do him justice. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
Quite honestly, I can't do him justice, and I don't know if Laurence, you would have a comment on that, but I would say Google him because I can't do him justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess the best way I'd answer it, when I work with people in supervision, particularly with psychodynamic supervision, what I always say to people is there are 1,000 different ways to look at the psyche. And part of the work you have to do, people will come to supervision, for example, quite often with this sort of fantasy that if they listen closely enough and read enough books, then they will know, and the answers will be are given to them. The reality is that's not true at all. I mean, I guess I'm a Jungian. There's lots of missing stuff within Jungian psychology. There's things I don't agree with. There are Jungians I don't like listening to. There are Jungians who I think are breathtakingly interesting. I think what we have to do is choose lenses that feel for us as though they resonate with our practice and our own psychology, recognizing that they're just lenses, but they're the lenses we're comfortable with. And I guess for me, Jordan Peterson doesn't speak to me.
Laurence, the element that, as people listen to this, I mean, the element that undercuts the whole conversation, and you just said it perfectly. I want to say in double quotes, you classified yourself in one way, but then you said, I'm open to all other perspectives.
Yeah.
That degree of maturity is profound.
I don't know many people who describe me as mature, but thanks very much for that. I'll take
but
it.
quite honestly, I mean, the field, I mean, I can't imagine that you disagree. The field lacks maturity because people embrace one perspective and make it their religion versus
Absolutely.
truly, and that goes, and we're doing ourselves in by doing that.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely true. Absolutely right there. I mean, this is if we acknowledge that the lenses we choose to work with are simply lenses that work for us and have limitations, that's good, actually. You know, I know behavioral coaches, I know NLP coaches who do great work, actually. The work they do is the work they do. They don't do my work. You know, we have different sorts of clients. We deal with different sorts of issues. There are things that I'm unable to deal with because I probably don't have the sort of psychological makeup to face those problems. And there are things that I'm just very good at, things that I'm really not very good at, that don't interest me, things I have no epistemological skill on. The question for the coach, in fact, I'll take one step back, if I may. We talk about coaching like it's a kind of monolithic thing, and it isn't. There's no such thing as a coach. I don't know what the thing is, or there's no such thing as a therapist. You know, these are all just terms we've made up. And they don't really mean anything when you examine them. I think if we're working with people in a developmental context, the real crucial question is, what work am I going to do? And am I able to do it? And that is almost the only thing that matters, if that makes sense.
And you used the word perfectly earlier, if you will. It is truly a partnership in the context of something greater than the parts. And truly, we could use more people like you out here. No. Laurence, let me put it that way. Because we question, we challenge our thinking ourselves before we challenge others, and think about how to have a broader impact in a very, very enlightened way. Yeah.
I think that's true.
So in the future, we're planning more events, and respectfully, I would hope you would entertain the invitation of joining us in some panel conversations amongst
anytime. I'm always up for a conversation on this topic.
Wonderful. I know I've taken a lot of time. I don't know, Todd, if you had more, or Laurence, if there's anything else, but I've taken a lot of time there.
No, I think they were all great questions, Cy. And Laurence, I guess, are there any kind of parting thoughts, or if someone wants to engage with you further, do you have a favorite platform that you are on online? Like, is LinkedIn sort of the place to find and engage with you the most?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn. I mean, and I like talking to people. So yeah, engage with me on LinkedIn. I guess the thing that I would say, though, as a final message, if I could, for me, this is the crucial thing for any coaching, consulting, developmental work, is you've got to have done the work on yourself first, and also cut yourself some slack. Recognize that you'll never be done, you'll never be finished, and that actually is one of the reasons coaches are good. Most of the coaches and therapists I work with are the ones who see development as an ongoing process. Those are the coaches and therapists that I aspire to be like, if that makes sense. And so I just hope, anyone listening, just think about your work as a work in progress.
Well, that's a really, really wonderful place to leave things, Laurence. Thank you so much for joining us again. We really appreciate your time. Absolutely. And just for everybody who joined us on this broadcast, thank you for tuning in. If you came to us live, or if you're watching this on the replay, we would love to hear your comments and ideas. And I'm sure we'll be watching those carefully, all three of us, to jump in and respond and keep the conversation going. Just a quick reminder that micro workshops are going to be happening on December the 9th, pretty much all day. I think we've got 3 different streams planned, maybe more, of different hands-on practical coaching events. And if you have not already, please like, share, and comment. Follow us on YouTube or on Facebook, wherever you happen to have encountered us. And we will be doing more of these in the near future. So thank you once again. Thank you, Laurence. Thank you, Cy. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Todd.
Thanks, gentlemen. All the best.
Thank you.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Stay safe.